What if a simple shipping mistake became the miracle that saved two broken souls? An unwanted mare, discarded and forgotten, arrives at the wrong address on a bitter winter morning. The widow who answers the door has lost everything that mattered. She doesn't want a horse. She doesn't want anything anymore. But what unfolds between them, a bond so profound it defies explanation, will shatter the silence of grief and bring an entire community to its knees. This is a story of impossible timing, of wounds that speak to each other across species, of a mistake that was never a mistake at all. If you believe in the mysterious ways that healing finds us, please hit that like button and subscribe. It truly helps our channel grow and share more stories just like this one. The town of Ashford sits in the cold lap of the Cascade foothills, a place where the rain doesn't fall so much as it settles, a constant gray mist that clings to the skin and seeps into the bones. It is a timber town gone quiet, its mills shuttered, its main street a row of faded storefronts with soap-streaked windows. The mountains rise behind it, dark and indifferent, their peaks hidden in clouds that never seem to lift. It is a place where people know each other's tragedies by heart, where grief is as common as the rain, where loss has worn grooves into the landscape itself. The winter had been particularly cruel. Ice storms had taken down power lines for days. The cold had settled in like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Margaret Dawson lived on the eastern edge of town in a gray craftsman house that had once been filled with light and laughter. Now it was a mausoleum. She was 53, though she looked older. Her hair, once a rich auburn, had gone to silver almost overnight. Her eyes, a pale green, seemed to look through things rather than at them. Her hands, once strong and capable, now trembled when she tried to hold a coffee cup. Her husband, Jim, had died 8 months ago. A heart attack in the garden, sudden and absolute. His body found among the gelato plants he'd been staking. The doctors said he hadn't suffered. Margaret knew that was a lie people told to make death easier to carry. She was the one suffering. Every breath was suffering. The house still smelled like him, old spice and sawdust, a ghost scent that made her chest ache. His boots were still by the door. His coat still hung on the hook. She couldn't touch them. She couldn't throw them away. She existed in a kind of terrible stasis, not living, not dying, just enduring. The town had tried to help at first. Casseroles appeared on her porch. Friends called. Her sister visited from Seattle, staying for 2 weeks, fussing and crying and trying to get Margaret to eat, to shower, to do anything. But Margaret had retreated into a silence so profound it frightened people. They stopped calling. They stopped visiting. They didn't know what to do with grief this large. On a Tuesday morning in late January, the sky the color of wet concrete, Margaret stood in her kitchen staring at the coffee maker. She had been standing there for 10 minutes. She couldn't remember if she'd already made coffee or if she was supposed to. Time had become slippery, unreliable. The days bled into each other, a gray smear with no beginning or end. She heard the sound of a diesel engine rumbling up her gravel driveway. She didn't move. She didn't care. Probably someone with the wrong address, looking for the Henderson place down the road. The engine cut off. A door slammed, heavy boots on the porch steps. A knock, loud and insistent, rattling the frame. Margaret considered not answering. She considered many things these days, most of them involving simply ceasing to exist. The knock came again, harder. "Mrs. Dawson, you home? Got a delivery here." The voice was male, impatient, already annoyed. Margaret shuffled to the door in her slippers, her bathrobe pulled tight. She hadn't showered in 3 days. She opened the door a crack, the cold air hitting her like a slap. A man in a stained canvas jacket and a feed store cap stood on her porch. Behind him, parked in her driveway, was a dented livestock trailer hitched to a mud-splattered truck. The trailer was rocking slightly. Something large was inside. "Margaret Dawson?" the man asked, squinting at a wrinkled invoice in his hand. "Yeah," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Got a horse here for you. Transport from the auction in Pendleton. You gonna sign or what?" "I got 3 more stops." Margaret blinked. The words made no sense. They were in the wrong order, in the wrong language. "I didn't order a horse," she said slowly. The man sighed, a long-suffering sound. He thrust the invoice at her. "Says right here, Margaret Dawson, 447 Spruce Lane, Ashford. That you?" She looked at the paper. The name was hers. The address was hers. But the rest of it, the description of a bay mare, age 12, the auction lot number, the transport fee, it was all completely foreign. "I don't know what this is," she said, trying to hand it back. "But I didn't order a horse. I don't have a horse. I don't want a horse." The man's patience, already thin, snapped. "Look, lady, I've been driving since 4 this morning. This horse has been on my trailer for 6 hours. The invoice says this address. You're gonna have to sort it out with whoever sent her. I just haul 'em. Now where do you want her?" "I don't want her anywhere," Margaret said, her voice rising, panic creeping in. "This is a mistake. You have the wrong person. This is 447 Spruce Lane, right? Yes, but then this is the right person. Sign here." He shoved a pen at her. Margaret felt something inside her crack, a fissure opening in the numbness. "I can't take a horse. I don't have anywhere to put a horse. My husband is dead, do you understand? I can't do this." The words came out too loud, too raw. The man took a step back, his annoyance shifting to discomfort. "Look, I'm sorry about your husband, but I can't take her back. The auction's done. She's been sold. She's paid for. She goes somewhere. If you refuse delivery, she'll end up at a slaughter facility by Friday. That's just how it works." The word slaughter hung in the cold air between them. Margaret looked past him at the trailer. She could see a dark shape moving inside, restless. She could hear the hollow sound of hooves on metal. She felt a sudden, sharp anger, hot and clean. Anger at this man. Anger at whoever had made this idiotic mistake. Anger at Jim for dying and leaving her alone to deal with things like this. Anger at the universe for its relentless, stupid cruelty. "Fine," she hissed. "Put her in the backyard. There's an old shed back there. Put her in there." The man's relief was immediate. He had her signature in 30 seconds. He backed the trailer up to the side gate, the beeping of the truck harsh and mechanical. He lowered the ramp with a clang. The mare came out hesitantly, her head low, her eyes wide and white-rimmed. She was a dark bay, almost black, her coat dull and shaggy with winter growth. She was thin, her ribs visible, her hip bones sharp angles. She had a white blaze down her face, crooked and faded. She looked as lost and bewildered as Margaret felt. The man handed Margaret a frayed lead rope. "She's all yours. Good luck." He was back in his truck and gone before Margaret could say another word, the sound of his engine fading down the road, leaving her standing in her bathrobe in the cold drizzle, holding a rope attached to a horse she didn't want. The mare stood very still, her head hanging, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She didn't pull, she didn't move. She just stood there, as if waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Margaret looked at her. The mare looked back. Two creatures who didn't want to be here, who didn't want to exist in this moment. "This is insane," Margaret whispered. She gave the rope a tentative tug. The mare followed, obedient and slow. Margaret led her through the side gate into the backyard. The grass was overgrown, dead and brown, tangled with blackberry vines Jim had always meant to clear. The shed was small, more of a glorified garden shelter, its roof sagging, its door hanging crooked. Margaret hadn't opened it in months. Inside it smelled of mildew and old motor oil. There were rusted tools, a lawnmower that hadn't run in years, bags of potting soil gone hard as concrete. It was completely unsuitable for a horse, but it was all she had. Margaret tied the mare's rope to a beam, her hands shaking. The mare didn't resist. She just stood there, her eyes half closed, her body radiating exhaustion and resignation. Margaret backed out of the shed, her heart pounding. She went back into the house and slammed the door. She leaned against it, breathing hard, her chest tight. What had she just done? She didn't know how to take care of a horse. She didn't know what horses ate or needed or how they worked. She had grown up in the suburbs. Jim had been the one who knew animals, who had talked about maybe getting chickens someday, a dog, a life. But Jim was gone, and now there was a horse in her shed. A horse she hadn't asked for. A horse that was probably going to die in there because she didn't know what to do. The thought should have filled her with panic. Instead, she felt nothing. Just the same gray emptiness that had filled her for 8 months. She walked to the kitchen. She picked up the phone. She stared at it. Who did you even call about an unwanted horse? She set the phone down. She made coffee, finally, though her hands shook so badly she spilled grounds across the counter. She didn't clean them up. She sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window at the shed. She could see the edge of it through the rain. She sat there for an hour. Then 2. The light began to fade. The temperature dropped. She thought about the mare standing in that cold, dark shed, alone, bewildered, waiting. She thought about slaughter facilities. She thought about a bullet. She thought about Jim in the garden, his heart stopping, the light going out. She thought about how everything just ends and nothing makes sense, and the universe doesn't care. Then she stood up. She didn't decide to. Her body just moved. She pulled on Jim's old work coat, the one that still smelled like him. She shoved her feet into his mud boots, too big, the rubber cold. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. She walked out into the rain. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet grass, the rusted gate, the shed. She opened the door. The mare was exactly where she'd left her, tied to the beam, her head low. She hadn't moved. She hadn't made a sound. She was just enduring. Margaret stepped inside. The mare's ears flicked toward her, but she didn't lift her head. Margaret stood there, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. "I don't know what to do with you," she said aloud. Her voice sounded strange in the silence, cracked and unfamiliar. The mare's eye, dark and liquid in the flashlight's glow, turned toward her. There was no expectation in it. No hope, just a deep animal weariness. Margaret knew that look. She saw it in the mirror every morning. She took a step closer. The mare didn't flinch. Margaret reached out, her hand shaking, and touched the mare's neck. The coat was rough and cold and damp. Beneath it, she could feel the warmth of living muscle, the slow, steady pulse of a heartbeat. The mare sighed, a long, shuddering exhale. Then, slowly, she lowered her head and rested her muzzle against Margaret's shoulder. It was a gesture of such simple, profound trust that it broke something open inside Margaret. A sob tore out of her, raw and ugly. Then another. She wrapped her arms around the mare's neck and cried, her body shaken, the tears she hadn't been able to shed for 8 months finally coming. The mare stood perfectly still. She didn't pull away. She just held the weight of this broken woman against her, patient and solid and warm. Margaret didn't know how long she stood there. Time stopped meaning anything. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back, wiping her face with the sleeve of Jim's coat. The mare was watching her, her eyes calm. "Okay," Margaret whispered. "Okay." She didn't know what she meant by that, but it was something. She untied the mare and led her out of the shed. The rain had stopped. The sky was clearing, stars appearing between the clouds. Margaret walked the mare across the yard, her flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. She opened the gate that led to the old paddock, a 1/4 acre of overgrown grass and broken fence that Jim had always planned to fix. The mare walked through the gate and stopped. She lifted her head. She looked at the sky, at the space, at the world that wasn't a trailer or a shed. Then she took 3 steps forward and dropped to her knees. She rolled, her legs thrashing, grunting with effort and something that sounded almost like relief. When she stood, shaking the dirt and grass from her coat, she looked different, less defeated, more alive. Margaret watched her, something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but something less than despair. She walked back to the house. She opened her laptop for the first time in weeks. She searched, "What do horses eat?" The internet, indifferent to her grief, provided answers. Hay, grain, water, shelter, companionship. She searched, "Feed store near me." She searched, "Equine vet Ashford." She made a list. Her handwriting was shaky but legible. In the morning, she would go to town. In the morning, she would figure this out. Not because she wanted to, but because a living thing was depending on her. And maybe that was enough. She looked out the window at the paddock. The mare was grazing, tearing at the dead grass with a kind of focused determination. Margaret watched her until the cold drove her back inside. That night, she slept for 4 hours straight. It was the most she'd slept since Jim died. When she woke, she didn't feel better, but she felt something, and that was new. The feed store in Ashford smelled of molasses and dust and animal warmth. Margaret stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the rows of supplies. The bags of grain stacked to the ceiling, the walls hung with halters and ropes and equipment whose purpose she couldn't begin to guess. A teenage boy behind the counter looked up from his phone. "Help you?" "I need hay," Margaret said. Her voice sounded strange, too loud in the quiet store. "And grain, for a horse." The boy blinked. "What kind of horse?" "A mare, bay. She's thin." "How thin?" Margaret had no frame of reference. Very thin, ribs showing. The boy's expression shifted, a flicker of concern. He came around the counter. "You just get her?" "Yesterday, from an auction." "Pendleton?" "I think so." The boy nodded, understanding something Margaret didn't. "Those auction horses, they're usually in rough shape. You're going to want to start her slow. Too much rich feed too fast and she'll colic. That'll kill her." The word kill landed hard. Margaret nodded. "Okay. What do I do?" For the next 20 minutes the boy, whose name was Danny, walked her through the basics. Grass hay, not alfalfa. A small amount of grain, gradually increased. Fresh water always available. Worming medication, hoof care. He wrote it all down on the back of a receipt. his handwriting surprisingly neat. "You ever had a horse before?" he asked. "No." "You got a vet?" "No." Danny pulled a business card from a corkboard behind the counter. "Doc Kevin. He's good. Doesn't charge too much. Tell him I sent you." Margaret took the card. She loaded her truck, Jim's truck, with 2 bales of hay and a bag of grain. Danny helped her, hefting the heavy bales into the bed with ease. "Good luck," he said. "What you're doing, taking in an auction horse, that's a good thing." Margaret didn't feel like she was doing a good thing. She felt like she was barely treading water. But she nodded and drove home. The mare was standing at the fence when Margaret pulled up, her head high, her ears pricked forward. She watched the truck with an intensity that surprised Margaret. When Margaret climbed out, the mare whinnied, a high, urgent sound. It was the first sound Margaret had heard her make. Margaret carried a bale of hay to the paddock, struggling with the weight, the wire cutting into her hands. She broke it open, the smell of dried grass sweet and dusty. The mare pushed past her, not roughly but with purpose, and buried her muzzle in the hay. She ate with a desperate, single-minded focus, as if she couldn't believe the hay was real. Margaret stood watching her. She felt Jim beside her, a ghost presence, his voice in her ear. "You're doing good, Maggie." That's what he would have said. She felt the ache of his absence like a physical wound, but she also felt something else, purpose, direction, a reason to get up tomorrow. She went back to the truck for the grain. She filled a dented metal bucket with water from the hose, her hands going numb in the cold. She set it in the paddock. The mare drank deeply, water spilling from the sides of her mouth. Margaret watched until the sun began to set, the sky turning pink and orange, colors she hadn't noticed in months. Then she went inside. She called the vet. Doc Kevin arrived the next afternoon in a truck that had seen better decades, a mobile veterinary unit that rattled and wheezed. He was in his 60s, a solid man with calloused hands and a face lined by sun and wind. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Let's see her," he said. Margaret led him to the paddock. The mare was lying down in the sun, a sight that had startled Margaret that morning, thinking the horse was dead or dying. Doc Kevin smiled. "That's a good sign. Means she feels safe." He approached slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice. The mare lifted her head but didn't stand. Doc Kevin ran his hands over her body, methodical and gentle, checking her teeth, her eyes, her hooves, listening to her heart and gut sounds with a stethoscope. Margaret stood back, anxious. Finally, Doc Kevin straightened, his knees cracking. "She's been neglected," he said bluntly. "Underweight, needs worming. Hooves haven't been trimmed in months, probably years. But she's sound. No injuries, no illness. She's just been forgotten." The word forgotten hit Margaret like a fist. "Can you help her?" "Sure, but it's going to take time, months, and it's going to take you. She needs consistency. She needs someone to show up every day." Margaret's eyes burned. "I can do that." Doc Kevin looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze kind but unflinching. "Danny at the feed store told me about you, about your husband." "I'm sorry." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "This horse," Doc Kevin continued. "She's been through something. I don't know what. But horses, they remember. They carry things, just like people." He pulled a syringe from his bag. "I'm going to worm her and give her a vitamin shot. I'll come back in 2 weeks to check on her. In the meantime, you keep doing what you're doing, hay, water, grain, and talk to her. Horses are good listeners." That night, Margaret sat on the back porch wrapped in a blanket, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. The mare was grazing under the stars, her dark shape moving slowly across the paddock. Margaret found herself talking, her voice low, carried away by the wind. She talked about Jim, about the garden, about the way he used to sing off-key in the shower, about the plans they'd had, the trips they'd never taken, the grandchildren they'd never have because their daughter lived across the country and rarely called. She talked about the silence of the house, the weight of his absence, the way grief felt like drowning in slow motion. The mare kept grazing, but her ears swiveled toward Margaret, tracking the sound of her voice. When Margaret finally fell silent, exhausted, the mare walked to the fence closest to the porch. She stood there, her head hanging over the rail, just being close. Margaret stood and walked to her. She rested her forehead against the mare's neck. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. The mare's breath was warm against her hair. In the morning, Margaret called the auction house in Pendleton. After being transferred 3 times, she finally reached someone who could access the records. "Lot 247, the woman said, the sound of typing in the background. "Bay mare, 12 years old. Owner surrender, no name listed. Sold for $230. Transport fee paid to an address in Ashford." "Who paid for it?" Margaret asked. "Who bought her?" "Says here it was a phone bid. Name is—" There was a pause. "Thomas Dawson. Does that help?" Margaret's vision blurred. The room tilted. "That's my husband," she whispered. "He died 8 months ago." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, this sale was 3 weeks ago." Margaret hung up. She sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. Jim couldn't have bought the horse. It was impossible. But the name, the address, the timing. 3 weeks ago would have been their anniversary. 31 years, the first one without him. She had spent that day in bed, unable to move, unable to breathe. Someone had used Jim's name. Someone had sent her this horse. But who? Why? She called their bank. Their joint account showed no unusual transactions. She called their credit card company. Nothing. She searched Jim's email, still active, still collecting spam. Nothing about a horse. Nothing about an auction. It was as if the transaction had appeared out of nowhere, a ghost purchase. Margaret's hands were shaking. She walked outside. The mare was standing at the fence, waiting. Margaret looked into her dark, calm eyes. "Who sent you?" she whispered. The mare had no answers. Only presence. Only the steady fact of her existence. Margaret decided it didn't matter. She decided to stop asking questions. Some things, she thought, you just accept. Some gifts you just take, even if you don't understand them. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Margaret woke before dawn, something she hadn't done since Jim died. She dressed in layers, in his old clothes that smelled less like him every day. She walked out to the paddock in the dark, her flashlight beam cutting through the mist. The mare would be waiting, her dark shape solid against the fence. Margaret would feed her, the ritual soothing in its simplicity. Hay in the morning, grain carefully measured, fresh water, the bucket scrubbed clean. She would talk while she worked, her voice filling the silence. She talked about anything and everything, the weather, the news, memories of Jim, her fears, her anger, her loneliness. The mare listened. She never walked away. She never seemed bored or impatient. She just stood, her ears swiveling, her eyes soft, as if Margaret's words were food she'd been starving for. Margaret began to notice changes. The mare's coat grew shinier, the dullness fading. Her ribs became less prominent, her eyes brighter. She moved differently, with more energy, more curiosity. She would greet Margaret with a low nicker, a sound of recognition and welcome that made Margaret's chest ache with unexpected tenderness. One morning, Margaret found herself grooming the mare, using a brush she'd bought at the feed store. She worked in slow, careful strokes, the rhythm meditative. The mare leaned into the brush, her eyes half closing in pleasure. Margaret realized she was humming, something she hadn't done in months, a song Jim used to love. She stopped, startled by the sound of her own voice. The mare turned her head, looking back at Margaret as if to say, "Keep going." So she did. She hummed, then sang, her voice rusty and uncertain. The mare's ear flicked, back, listening. When the song ended, Margaret was crying again. But this time the tears felt different, not the raw, tearing grief of before. Something softer, something that held both sorrow and gratitude. "I think I'll call you Kira," she said, "because that's what you are. Something I didn't ask for, something I didn't earn, but here you are anyway." The mare, Kira, blew softly through her nostrils, a sound of contentment. Margaret rested her head against Kira's shoulder and felt, for the first time since Jim died, like she might survive this. Like she might actually want to. The town began to notice. Margaret, who had disappeared into her grief, was suddenly visible again. She was at the feed store every week. She was calling Doc Kevin with questions. She was out in her yard, fixing fence, clearing brush, working with a kind of focused determination that people recognized and respected. Danny from the feed store stopped by one Saturday with a load of better hay. "Heard you needed some," he said, unloading it without being asked. Margaret tried to pay him. He waved her off. "My dad runs the store. He said to tell you the first load's on the house. Welcome back gift." Margaret's eyes stung. "Thank you." "That mare's looking good," Danny said, nodding toward Kira, who was watching them from the paddock. "Real good. You're doing right by her." After he left, Margaret stood in her driveway and looked at her house, her yard, her life. It didn't look so dead anymore. It looked like something she was tending, something growing. That week, her sister called from Seattle. "Maggie, you sound different," she said, her voice cautious, hopeful. "Do I?" Margaret asked. "Yeah, you sound like you're here, like you're present." Margaret looked out the window at Kira, grazing in the afternoon light. "I guess I am," she said. "I got a horse." "A what?" Her sister's shock was almost comical. Margaret laughed, a real laugh, unexpected and bright. "It's a long story, but she's helping. I think she's saving my life." There was a long pause. Then her sister, crying now, said, "Good. That's good, Maggie. Hold on to that." In early March, Doc Kevin came for a follow-up visit. He walked Kira around the paddock, checking her movement, her weight, her overall condition. When he finished, he smiled. "She's a different horse," he said. "You've done good work here." "She's done the work," Margaret said. "I'm just showing up." "That's all any of us can do," Doc Kevin said. He hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I did some digging after our first visit, called some folks I know. Found out where Kira came from before the auction." Margaret's heart lurched. "Where?" "She was a therapy horse. Worked at a facility for kids with disabilities for almost a decade. When the program lost funding, they had to sell off the horses. Kira was one of them. The director said she was the best they ever had. Gentle, patient, intuitive. She said that horse could sense when A kid was about to have a meltdown before anyone else could. She'd walk over and just stand with them until they calmed down. Margaret's vision blurred. She looked at Kira, standing calmly by the fence, her eyes kind. She was trained to help people, she whispered. She was, Doc Kevin said, and I think she still is. After he left, Margaret walked to Kira and wrapped her arms around her neck. You've been doing this your whole life, haven't you? Taking care of broken things. Kira nuzzled her gently, her breath warm and steady. Margaret closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not giving up on me. The transformation didn't go unnoticed in Ashford. People began to stop by, tentatively at first. Neighbors Margaret hadn't spoken to in months. Friends who had drifted away, unsure how to navigate her grief. They came with offerings, excuses to visit. A bag of apples for the horse, carrots, an old blanket. They stood at the fence and talked, not about Jim, not about death, but about Kira, about her coat, her eyes, the way she moved. And in talking about Kira, they talked to Margaret. They brought her back into the world. One afternoon, a woman named Helen, who lived 3 houses down, arrived with her granddaughter, a girl of about 8 with large, solemn eyes. She's been through a hard time, Helen said quietly while the girl stood frozen by the gate. Her parents are divorcing. She's not talking much. I thought maybe... She trailed off, uncertain. Margaret understood. Come on, she said, taking the girl's hand. She led her into the paddock. Kira walked over immediately, lowering her head to the child's level. The girl reached out with a trembling hand and touched Kira's muzzle. Kira stood perfectly still, her eyes soft, her breathing slow and even. The girl began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Kira didn't move. She just stood, solid and patient, letting the child lean against her. Helen, watching from the fence, was crying too. After a long moment, the girl whispered something too quiet for Margaret to hear. Kira's ear flicked toward her. The girl whispered again, and this time Margaret caught it. It's okay to be sad. Kira lowered her head further, resting her muzzle against the girl's chest. Yes, Margaret said, kneeling beside them both. It's okay to be sad. And it's okay to be happy again. Both things can be true. The girl looked at her with ancient eyes. Is that what she teaches you? Every single day, Margaret said. Word spread. A single mother brought her autistic son who wouldn't speak to anyone. He sat in the grass beside Kira for an hour, not speaking, not touching, just existing in her calm presence. When he left, he was smiling. An elderly man, recently widowed, came and stood at the fence, watching Kira graze. Margaret brought him coffee. They didn't talk. They just stood together in the silence, and it was enough. A teenager with scars on her wrist came referred by the school. Counselor. She brushed Kira for 40 minutes, crying the entire time. When she left, she hugged Margaret. Thank you, she whispered. Margaret hadn't planned any of this. She hadn't set out to create something, but it had grown organically, naturally, the way healing does when you stop forcing it. By late April, Kira and Margaret had become a fixture in the community's consciousness. People spoke about them with a kind of reverence, the widow and the rescue horse who were saving each other. One evening, Margaret sat on her porch watching Kira, who was standing in the paddock with her eyes closed, soaking up the last warmth of the sun. Margaret thought about Jim, about the mystery of Kira's arrival, about the auction transaction that had never been explained. She had stopped trying to understand it. Some things were bigger than understanding. Some things you just received with gratitude. Doc Kevin pulled up the driveway, unannounced, his truck coughing to a stop. He climbed out, holding a manila envelope. "Thought you should see this," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a letter, written in shaky handwriting on lined paper. Margaret read it slowly, her heart accelerating with each word. The letter was from a woman named Ruth. She lived in a nursing home in Pendleton. She had been Jim's nurse. During his business trips to Eastern Oregon, trips Margaret had known about, Jim had volunteered at a therapeutic riding center. Ruth had worked there before her stroke. In the letter, Ruth explained that Jim had talked about Margaret constantly, about her grief after losing their son 20 years ago in a car accident, a grief Margaret had never fully healed from, about his own helplessness in the face of it, about wishing he could give her something that would help. Before Jim died, he had set up an automatic payment, a trust Ruth was executor of. The instructions were clear. If anything happened to him, Ruth was to use the funds to purchase Kira, the gentlest horse at the center, and have her delivered to Margaret on their anniversary. The paperwork had taken months. The auction, a coincidence of timing when the center closed. But Jim had arranged it all. From beyond death, he had sent her Kira. Margaret couldn't breathe. The letter shook in her hands. Jim had known. He had known that after he was gone, she would need something to care for, something that needed her, something that would pull her out of the darkness. Doc Kevin stood quietly, giving her time. "He loved you," Doc Kevin said finally. "He really loved you." Margaret nodded, tears streaming. "I need to go to her, to Kira." She stood and walked to the paddock on unsteady legs. Kira lifted her head, her ears pricked forward. Margaret opened the gate and walked in. She wrapped her arms around Kira's neck and sobbed, pouring out 8 months of grief, rage, loneliness, and finally, gratitude. Kira stood solid and warm and patient, bearing the weight of it all. "He sent you," Margaret whispered. "He knew. He knew I'd need you." Kira turned her head, pressing her muzzle against Margaret's back, holding her in return. The town of Ashford learned the story when Margaret shared Ruth's letter at a community meeting. She hadn't planned to speak, but the mayor was presenting her with a plaque, something about community service. And Margaret found herself standing at the microphone, the letter in her hands. She read it aloud, her voice breaking, the room utterly silent. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. People approached her afterward, hugging her, crying with her. The story spread beyond Ashford. A local newspaper picked it up, then a regional magazine. Then, somehow, it went viral online. The tale of a husband's final gift, a rescue horse, and a widow learning to live again. But Margaret didn't read the articles. She didn't do interviews. She stayed home with Kira, living the quiet reality behind the story. She continued to welcome visitors, anyone who needed the particular kind of healing that Kira offered. The paddock became a sanctuary, a place where grief was honored and hope was possible, where silence was okay and tears were welcome, where a horse, once unwanted and forgotten, proved that love could reach across death and that the right creature at the right time could change everything. On a warm June evening, nearly 6 months after Kira's arrival, Margaret stood in the paddock watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and pink. Kira was grazing nearby, her coat gleaming, her body strong and healthy. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been that January morning when the trailer pulled up. Hollow, broken, barely alive. She thought about Jim, about his incredible, impossible final gift. She thought about all the people who had come through this gate, carrying their pain, leaving lighter. She thought about the mystery of it all, the perfect timing, the exact right horse, the way Kira finds you when you've stopped looking for it. Kira walked over and rested her head on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture she did often now. Margaret stroked her neck, feeling the warmth, the life, the steady pulse of a beating heart. "Thank you," she whispered to Kira, to Jim, to whatever force in the universe arranges these impossible mercies. "Thank you for teaching me that the wrong address can be the right destination, that mistakes can be miracles, that even in the deepest grief, love is still working, still reaching, still finding ways to save us." Kira sighed, her breath warm against Margaret's neck. And Margaret, for the first time in a year, felt peace. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of love to transcend even death and the capacity of animals to heal what seems broken beyond repair, please share this video. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of hope, healing, and the extraordinary bonds that save us when we need it most. Because sometimes the greatest miracles don't look like miracles at all. Sometimes they look like a mistake. Sometimes they arrive in a livestock trailer on a cold morning. Sometimes they have 4 hooves and a patient heart. And sometimes they change everything.